Okay, so I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement, and then we'll do a little bit of an introduction for Josh, and then he's going to get started for us, okay? So we begin today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. And if you're not in the stores area where Yukon is and you know whose territory you are on, you could throw that in the chat. That'd be really great for us all to acknowledge who we're here with. So tonight, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Joshua Whitehead, a person who I so admire for his talent, courage, and just all around pizzazz. And he's also someone that I have the honor of calling my friend. I have been wanting to bring Josh and his work to Yukon for some time, and I feel so lucky to be in a position that has allowed me to do this. Of course, this was by no means accomplished alone. Before I talk about Josh's work, I'd like to take a moment to thank our generous co-sponsors, Penelope Pelizon, Ellen Littman, and Anna Ziering from the Creative Writing Program, Kelsey O'Neill and staff from the Rainbow Center, Bob Hasenfratz and the faculty from the English Department, and Sherry Zane and the faculty from the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department. Without their help, this event wouldn't have been possible. I'd also like to thank NACP's student staff who have worked tirelessly this semester to put together fantastic programming. Tonight's event is sure to be no exception. Joshua Whitehead is a two-spirit Oji-nêhiyaw. Did I get it right? Almost. Pretty close. Member of the Peguis First Nation under Treaty 1. He is a PhD candidate, lecturer, and Killam Scholar at the University of Calgary, where he studies Indigenous literatures and cultures with a focus on gender and sexuality. His dissertation, tentatively titled Feral Fatalisms, which I love, is a hybrid narrative of theory, essay, and nonfiction that interrogates the role of ferality inherent within Indigenous ways of being. His first book, Full Metal Indigi-queer, uses poetry to hybridize the organic and the technologic through the trickster figure Zoa. Zoa becomes a virus, infecting and rewriting canonical and pop culture works in order to center two-spirit lives. Full Metal Indigi-queer was shortlisted for the Indigenous Voices Award and the Stephen G. Stephenson Award. Josh's second book, this time a fiction novel, Jonny Appleseed, is a provocative and moving amalgamation of love, sex, trauma, kinship, ambition, and heartbreak. One reviewer said, Joshua Whitehead redefines what queer Indigenous writing can be for his powerful debut novel, Jonny Appleseed, and I couldn't agree more. Jonny Appleseed was shortlisted for several awards and also won the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Fiction and the Georges Bugnet, I don't know, French, maybe not, Award for Fiction. Josh's most recent publication is an edited collection that just came out in the last few months, Love After the End, which I have here and I'm so excited for. I've been waiting, Josh, forever for this one. Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit and indigi-queer speculative fiction, brings together new and emerging two-spirit and queer Indigenous writers from across Turtle Island to imagine a better world wherein two-spirit queerness can thrive. I don't want to keep you waiting too much longer, so I'll just quickly say that at the end of Josh's talk, he will be taking your questions, so you can private message me or one of the other NACP workers, Zoe or Sage, and we can read your questions for you. Or if you feel comfortable, you can put your name in the chat and we will call on you. Also, stick around at the end to hear if you won the raffle for a copy of one of Josh's books. And now, with a virtual round of applause, we've got Joshua Whitehead.
Hi, my friends. As Kayla introduced, I am Josh. I'm so happy that you all decided to join me here today on the eve of which should hopefully be a very hopeful day tomorrow for everyone, and most importantly, you folks. Yeah, so I'm a bit of a hybrid person, an academic, a storyteller, a writer in various different capacities. So I'm going to share a little bit of a keynote today, which is kind of steeped in, so hopefully you take some hope away from it, and discussing the rising collective voices of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. I don't respect the boundaries of the nation states of Canada, US, or Mexico in saying Turtle Island, and nor do I respect the boundaries of genres. So this is kind of a little bit of a fusion, I guess I would say, of what we might call theory and storytelling. It's all kind of very similar to me. So I write this keynote, as I'm sure we're all aware, in the age of COVID-19, which is a time of global pandemics, social and physical distancing, and a time of unprecedented mourning, loss, and historical triggers. I find it particularly apt for us to be sharing story together here, if only because this is a story that highlights a longevity of both virology and a historicity of genocidal biowarfare used against Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island since the very first docking of colonial powers into our homelands. I've asked myself, who names an event apocalyptic, and for who must apocalypse effect in order for it to be thought of as canon? How do we pluralize apocalypses as ellipses? And if so, who is omitted from such a saving of space? And whose material is relegated to the immaterial in this pluralization of apocalypse? Here too, I'm crafting a theory of what I call indigi-queerness, which is just a kind of a braiding together of both queerness and indigeneity, so that Indigenous queer folks don't have to obliterate either Indigenous or queer to be simultaneously both. So I'm attempting to kind of craft this theory of indigi-queerness by rejecting queer and rejecting LGBT as signposts of my identity, instead relying on the sovereignty of what we might call traditional language, using the kind of pan-English term right now, two-spirit, and also terminology we craft for ourselves, such as indigi-queer. Questions I'm often asking are, how does queer indigeneity upend or upset queerness? Are we, as queer Indigenous peoples, queerer than queer? Who defines queerness, and under whose banners does it fly? Whose lands is it pocked within? I churn these words over in my mouth, and I taste that queer Cree on my tongue and wonder if they are enough, like Waneatasmoin, or the Nêhiyaw or Cree word for queer, as in strange, but it is also defined as uncanny or unsettling, which I quite like. Or Wanateomewin, the act of being deranging or perplexing. I find indigi-queerness a hinterland, in queer indigeneity a ferality. For surely the histories of virologies are written into our codex, from smallpox to HIV and AIDS to H1N1 and now to COVID-19. The histories of our queerness, our transness, our non-binariness, our indigeneity arc back to originality, and our vertebrae as these peoples are blooming heartberries and dripping seedlings. What does it mean to be two-spirit during apocalypse? I keep finding myself asking. What does it mean to search out romance at a pipeline protest? Can we have intimacy during doomsday? How do we fuck in a sleeping bag outside of City Hall? How do we procure intimacy in this time when the very ground is shaking beneath us with military tanks and thunderous gallops? What does it mean to be distanced under the weight of colonial occupation and relocation? A story we know all too well. We find one another in the cybersphere or the hyper-res sphere. We find each other in the arenas of dreamscapes and love grounds. We emerge in pixel and in airwave, and we have never lost the magic of our glamour within such a narrativized I, the pronoun I, and of our narrativized I, EYE. I suppose I note these ruminations in order to announce that two-spirit and indigi-queerness are the wildest kinds of biopunks, literally and literarily. I too am speaking and writing this in the era of unprecedented Indigenous resistance to the nation states we call our homelands, be they Canada or the United States. I have taken part in and witnessed the rise of anti-Indigenous violence, rhetoric, and political inaction from the Mi'kmaq fishermen of the East here in Canada, Wet'suwet'en in the West, the Moose moratoriums and land back lane in the center, and the Kumeyaay wall defense of the South. We have bore witness to the anniversary of the Kanesatake resistance, or what Canadian settlers like to call the Oka crisis. Hashtag land back political activism, both on the ground and in the digital worlds. Hashtag shut down Canada protests pouring through the streets of this nation state. BLM, Black Lives Matter as a global and regional resistance, and but 24 hours before the US election. We are in a state of precarity and preordained death by and for Indigenous and Black and Afro-Indigenous folks. Not that we ever existed without such a bear trap around our limbs. I can speak on how this era has affected me physically, mentally, and spiritually. And I think it speaks to Indigenous power that I am here with you all today, in this month, in this time, in the very scope of settler colonialism's sniper rifles. I'm often trying to find hope in these times, a time in which my ability to work as an artist and as a freelance writer has been gravely impacted by COVID-19 and conservative provincial governments here in Alberta, one that relegates artists, among other essential workers such as nurses and teachers, as unnecessary, as unneeded, even though I can guarantee you that what has gotten most of these conservative folks through COVID-19 has been the arts themselves. I am sorely in need of many things, one of them being physical touch, as this is my love language. I am starved of intimacy in these times, but also I am so very dehydrated of hope, of something to look forward to. My kin and I make plans for when this is over. And while this futuristic hope is empowering, it reminds me of how very much embroiled we are within a system of continual warring. When is over, I ask? Will that day ever come? Will our collective hope bloom into that revolutionary Endian joy when we emerge onto the other side of this ever-growing junk heap? Can our calves carry us across such hilltops, such chasms? I have to hope it will. I often turn to Uji-nêhiyaw or Cree for instruction. We have the word Peguis for the word hope, which also braids in desire. So desire and hope are in the same word, Peguis, which reminds me of the word, if only we swap out an A for an E in the root word for hope, Peguis, or which is defined as the act of surfacing or of rising to the top, which also means the emerging place. So we have both of these words, Peguis and Pakosomoin. So I'm hopeful about these animating verbs, and just a quick overview here. So in Uji-nêhiyaw or in Cree, we don't have genders. We've never had genders. So like French and English, when we address something such as a table or a desk or the sun, like we would engender those. Within Cree, at least, we forego gender, and instead we have animations. So when we address something, we, instead of attributing it to masculinity or to femininity, we would address it as animate or inanimate. So in that animations, unlike Western linguistic systems, we would animate things that English would deem as not animate. So for example, like the sun, the bodies of land, bodies of water, grandfather rocks, the trees themselves, we would address these as animate. And when we address them as animate, we are noting that we are in relation with them. So we don't have this kind of vertical hierarchy of humans at the top and perhaps like insects at the bottom. It's more of a circular, holistic kinship web or system. So we are caretakers for trees and water as much as they caretake for us, right? Quick little overview of that one. So I'm looking at these two words, Peguis and Peguis. Again, the first meaning hope, the second meaning kind of the act of rising or surfacing, and also meaning emerging place. So I am hopeful about these animating verbs in Cree fashion, as they give rise to how I would read the current state of Indigenous literatures within and upon our collective Turtle Island. The root word in both of these is peko, which appears in the words pekomeu, or she or he wakes by speech and sound. Okay, so I am reminded here of one of my leaders from my homelands in Manitoba, Louis Riel, who famously orated, "My people will sleep for 100 years, but when they wake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back." So, pekomeo, or she or he wakes by speech, pekobewin, surfacing into the emerging place, hope, emergence, speech, as giving rise to awakenness. So we are our own best creation story here in this era of apocalypse I am trying to kind of paint a picture of. We become in, I guess, an Oji-nêhiyaw fashion, which is from my linguistic systems and community, muskrat themselves, which is one of the animals of the creation story, who dives down to the bottom of the ocean, grabs this hand of mud and puts it onto the back of the turtle, thereby kind of creating Turtle Island, right? So I'm using these words, hope, she or he is wakened by sound, and the emergent place, right? Which all are coming from the same root word, peko. So I'm noting here that we are our own best creation story here in this era of apocalypse. We become muskrat themselves as we dive to the bottom of this pond, which is now turned into a swamp from ecological destruction, and we collect the silt needed to deadhead a new mound to light on. I think here of the recently published Oprah magazine from a couple of days ago, an article titled, quote, 31 Native American authors to read right now, upon which I was one among what I would consider legends like Joy Harjo, Tommy Orange, Therese Mayo, Natalie Diaz, Tommy Pico, Cherie Dimaline, Leanne Howe, and Linda Hogan, just to name a few. I have also had the great pleasure here in Canada, the nation state we call Canada, to watch Cree writer Billy Ray Belcourt become the youngest ever winner of the prestigious Griffin Poetry Prize with his book, This Wound is a World. I have watched trans Cree writer Ariel Twist just win the Dane Ogilvie Award for Emerging Queer Writers. I have watched Tanya Tagak, Enoch singer / writer, Adam Garnett Jones, queer Cree writer / beadwork artist, Nathan Adler, Jay Simpson, Tennille Campbell, Kainash Pyle, who is also here, emerge into these spaces and sweep up award nominations, accolades, and publications. Again, just to name but a few. So what this tells me of what and who is rising is Indigenous women and queer Two-Spirit Indigenous folks. We are called upon and awoken in this era of pain and mourning, but also this time of accomplishment and revelatory politics. These, I believe, go hand in hand, destruction and the thrum of collective singing. Hence, hopeful utopias emerge. And I guess I would say this is my kind of call, that we have to build and build now in order for us to find some type of sanctuary in which we and all others can live, Indigenous, BIPOC. This is a time that we must collectively build. There is no plan or planet B for us to turn to. In Nêhiyaw, or the Cree language, we also have the word nikanik for in the future. And within that word is nikana, or put her or him in front. Here, within this time we are in, I would say we have done just that. I am trying to do just that, is to put Indigenous women, queer, Indigenous, and Two-Spirited peoples in the front for once, and in that leading position. So we will all walk together in the future in whatever form that may take. Hand in hand, though, strong, resilient, extraneously queer, extraneously femme, extraneously women, singing a round dance song that calls us all back in together. So I guess I bring forward this short, concise history in order to say we have lived in torture chambers, we have excelled under the weight of killing machinations time and time again, and we've hardened into bedrock among this collective apocalypse and the apocalypse as ellipses, and note, see how our bodies dazzle in the light. Now, I just wanted to kind of give that as a beginning space for this in order to talk about, Indigenous voices rising, which some of those writers that I gave are just a handful of a few. And it's hopeful for me as a writer, also very much an emerging writer, to be in this space. And I think what is differentiating, at least right now, this cresting wave of Indigenous writers who are emerging or just newly published, is that we are doing work a little differently than I would say how Canadian or American literature asks us or preordains for us to be as writers or artists in that sense. And I can speak for myself, is that I've tried to forego the individualistic rise to the top, whatever that means. And really in 2020 have stepped back from, I guess, working on my own new work in order to kind of work collaboratively and collectively to kind of also make space and push space forward to bring in new writers, new queer, new trans, new non-binary, Indigenous women writers into the space as well, which I think for me is like the politic that I take hand in hand. Because again, in Cree, we have the word Otachimo, which is how I would define myself. And that just means storyteller. Again, because I don't believe in the borders of genre, the borders of form. Oratory is oratory and is animate in whatever form it may be, me speaking to you or of you as a reader animating on the page, right? So I think the work for me is I've always tried to define literature as synonymous with accountability. And in doing that, I think it's the job for the writer, the artist, or the storyteller to also make space and bring those along with them to the forefront, into that same circle, into that kind of hopeful future, Nikanak, right? So that's what I've been trying to do. 2020, I've been stepped back and I've had the absolute pleasure, as Kaylee showed, to release the anthology, Love After the End. And the subtitle is an anthology of queer and two-spirit utopias and speculative fiction. And it was like the absolute honor, I would say, of my accolades right now to have done that and to have made space for that and to have brought those writers to the forefront too. And just knowing that they're there side by side, that just fills me with hope about where we are going together as Indigenous writers, as Afro-Indigenous writers, as a collective Black and BIPOC writers, what we're making and really kind of changing the kind of literary landscape of both American and Canadian literature. So I thought I would share a brief essay which is both from my Feral Fatalism's dissertation proposal, and is also Two Birds, One Stone for me. Going to be part of my new book, collective book called Making Love with the Land, which is creative nonfiction, and really ruminates on indigeneity, queerness, and mental health. So this one's a little bit about creative writing and publishing and just writing in general. And I've titled it On Bodies of Writing. So I have long argued from and for the body. I have noted that the physical body we inhabit, the zipper of skin, will always be inherently tied to the body of text we produce. I think this particularly true for BIPOC, disabled, queer, and or women writers, and or any intersection thereof. Specifically, that we don't have the ability to write simply of aesthetics. I can never write a poem about the shapeliness of a teacup for the sake of the teacup. For me, such cuppings are always bound within political poetics because of two truths. One, that settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy have failed, and two, because my existence has and will always be a radical act of political livelihood as a queer Indigenous person, such that when I write from the body, how story is attached to me integrally, umbilically, and we feed and nourish one another like regurgitant birds. To think that one is a master, albeit while running a master class or desiring to master craft, is wholly violent. Stories are oratory, even when written on the page, for they, as the Cree linguistic system needs, require animations in order to be serviced. And such an animation in Cree fashions makes story an animate being too, living vocabulary, kin we are accountable to. I refuse to be trauma bonded with my stories I hold like lovers. Dare I place a possessive my in acknowledging my stories? Too often such possessions rouse in me a wick that feels too much like a wildfire. How then is storying akin to lovemaking? Let's say you find me beautiful, but you are only able to comment on the aesthetic, not the animations of this thing I might call a skin story. emptied adjective beautiful. To say it with merit, you'd need to know how the body book enfolds, spines both engorged and enveloped. You would need my body to challenge you, fatally so, to the point it asks you to rethink that recycled verb love and in lieu ask you about loss. All the while pondering maybe in the sweaty lens of a camera or a misting iris, where is the fascinating pornography of the world and who is the flawed auteur? Instead, in writing, let me make a universe of a freckle, focus less on the grand and more in on the mundane. Entire bodies of rich stories are written in the minute. I respect that of a writer inasmuch as I respect it in a lover, the ways in which languages mix with odor, and I am forever huffing oratory. I find storying often a series of attractions, like when I undress you, bear witness to your majesty. Here I don't feign a bow to monarchy, this you I'm animating here being from the European Union, but rather I ask, how does any single body exist so multifariously? You'll reply coyishly, as if this embarrassment or this compliment strikes a tender tendon, and you'll brush it off. I'll shy away so as not to embarrass. I'll turn off the lights and make love to you and know in the tasting of a vowel on your nipple, the perfume of syntax wafting from your oils in your nose, that a body and all of its glories, wrecked and steadfast, is lit here in the dark with language, with euphemism, with allegory. I trace your body as I would a map, spelling homebound in the clavicle, and I wayfind boisterously because I am not ready for rest. This, I'll think, is an entry point into poetics. Whichever came first, though, the poetic or the erotic. I'm looking for me, but I've hidden bits of myself in each of you. I unfold like a crane, intricately, delicately, into origami, originality. I feel most of my work is about memorialization. I find myself stuck in the maw of memory far too often. Creative writing classes will never teach you about what storying costs the body. I'd go so as far as to say that the act of looking back can be such a disservice or a servicing of undoing, inasmuch as I might even call nostalgia such a brilliantly fatal flaw, if not utilized earnestly. If the body of text that we produce is intrinsically tied to our physical bodies, the mining of such embodiments can often be a harmful unearthing. BIPOC writers already house labyrinths of trauma, inherited, enforced, and lived, that to travail these depths in order to narrate the stories we need will always be a risky undertaking. Take, for example, my poem, Mikogwani, a poem that won me a Governor General's History Award in 2016 and was published in my book, Full Metal indigi-queer. The poem is about my kukum, or grandmother, who was murdered in the King's Hotel in Saskatoon, forcing my father into the regiment of the 60s scoop, also into abusive foster cares, day schools, and later homelessness before he found my mother and began a more stable life. In 2018, I was asked to come to a literary festival in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, whereupon I was placed in a billet for the duration of my stay in the city. I have a tumultuous relationship with that city, as it was the space where my grandmother was murdered. I rarely dare to set foot in it, lest it be to visit the unmarked grave of my grandmother. In this billet, I was placed with a man who was not part of the festival, but someone who offered his home. My room had no lock. My bed was a fold-out cushioned couch on the floor, and there was a turtle in the room who despised my presence. This turtle banged his body against the glass for the entirety of my time in our temporary shared space. I felt entirely unsafe, often calling my then partner to reassure me that I would in fact be okay. He pleaded with me to find a cheap motel to stay in, a deepened anxiety of mine given my grandmother's murder was in a motel. The city felt like a death chamber to me. I was not harmed physically or verbally during my stay, but the precarity of my safety in the night in an unlocked room with a man I did not know kept me staring at the walls, the turtle's thrumming synchronized with my own racing heartbeat in the broken constellation we call this country. In the morning, I was asked to join a local radio station who asked me about my stay in Saskatoon and my writing in general. Mikogwani, again the poem, was referenced and brought about as a topic of discussion. The radio booth we were in was air conditioned, actually quite frigidly, and yet as these men asked me rather invasive questions about my grandmother's life, by which they meant to dance around the subject of murder and missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited peoples, I could not stop myself from sweating. There were two instances where we had to stop our short 30-minute interview because my glasses would slip off my face from wet temples. I asked for 2 bathroom breaks to dab my forehead and armpits, my back then stained into tectonic markings, and splash my face with the coldest water I could gather from the faucet. I joked that I felt I had a cold coming on, that it was giving me fever-like symptoms, so as to abate the situation, and also to enforce distance between myself and them from their fear of catching said cold. I came to the conclusion that in this city, so heavy with trauma and loss for me, my pores ached to mourn too. That as I left my unresolved anger and fear as foregone affects, my central nervous system chose to cry in lieu. When I got back home to Calgary, my then partner asked, "So how was it?" And the only response I could muster, again to soothe any of his anxieties or worry, was, "I survived." This has been an ongoing deflective joke I've been making throughout my life, especially within writing and the career that has afforded me, that I now have to ask, is saying, I survived, an ethical joke to make anymore? In Toronto, and this is late 2018, I was asked to do a radio interview over the phone. By this point in time, I had been on the literary road for quite some time, living out of my suitcase, returning home only for a few short days in order to do my laundry and repack, having to leave my loved ones at home, and working to the bone in order to help garner publicity and sales for my then recently published novel, Jonny Appleseed. While in Toronto, a reporter, having researched me thoroughly prior, directly asked me, "So Josh, can you tell me how the death of your aunt has influenced your novel?" Being more of a fledgling writer, I accommodated this request and reluctantly retold my story of my aunt's death, to which the reporter nodded, jotted down notes, quickly thanked me, and then hung up the phone. What has shaken me about this experience is that it was not the first time that that type of extractive questioning about personal and communal histories and my experiences with trauma has cropped up, nor will it be the last. And while the reporter remains or maintains the agency to leave unencumbered by wounds, they have yet inflicted another, having received from me fresh insight into my book and into my life, again, twinning bodies. I found myself in downtown Toronto, racked with grief and holding myself steady through a particularly intense anxiety attack. It was a slaughtering. I felt disembodied. I reeled on the balls of my feet amongst an onslaught of noise pollution, honking cars, pedestrian babble, sirens, the heavy rumble of a train. I found myself in the downtown Eaton Centre in Toronto, sitting in the food court, sobbing uncontrollably, much to the dismay of those eating around me. The sight of grief on an Indian, a jarring one. How can the inquisition for and the distribution of knowledge be a type of assault if not done with protocol and with ethics? How are queer Indigenous writers, many of whom, as I narrated earlier, at the forefront of what we now call can lit, made out to be wholly disposable under the guise of benevolence and of diversity? How does the purchase of a text, say Jonny Appleseed, here $18, make for a type of allowance on the part of the consumer or reader to have unbridled access to a writer's life, specifically a BIPOC writer's life, to survey their bodies as if they were objects of curiosity? How does such disposability link or braid with our understandings of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited peoples? Can a story be eaten like a body? Perhaps I mean to say that storytelling under the banner of Canadian or American literature as a queer Indigenous writer is to make for a type of peeping, voyeurism, stripping, the expectation of and for the unveiling of bodies, histories, communities, traumas. It is a rare occurrence indeed for a BIPOC writer, interviewer, or host to ask me about craft. They instead weave politeness and curiosity into their desires to survey the history of my body with what I might call literary voyeurism. Lately, I have chosen creative nonfiction to attempt to answer some of these questions, to unpack these expectations, to lay claim to the sovereignty my body houses, and if I must strip in this literary voyeurism, to do so on my own terms. Another lesson my character Jonny has taught me. I find the genre of creative nonfiction, the essay, an apt one, if only because one, it allows me to control the sovereignty of this machine I call a body, to have agency in widening or lessening the whole from which the reader gawks at my glory, because I control the I of my pronoun I, albeit in the form of morphing my body into metaphor, or as a sidebar, to interrogate that the truth I am examining is never universal, that objectivity is always tinted by subjectivity, and I am only ever finding circumlocution. Such a form of confession then becomes a meditation on literary voyeurism. The optics of witnessing are a wager that I maintain, and as one consenting to such a form of oral and oral play within such a genre, the benefits seem steeped in my favor if I can maintain those gambits. And two, many of these narratives I am writing about are ones that I have dealt with or am dealing with alongside professional mental health services that I've been attending now for the greater part of 18 months. Perhaps I could name this genre of the essay, creative nonfiction, an exorcism, one that rather than removing a revenant from the structure of one's home or body, it asks, least of all for me, to think of pain or joy or wounds or scars as kin, again, as animate, kin that I house and am accountable to. It asks me to reconceptualize trauma and mental health as ancestral knowledge in lieu of thinking of it as a virus to a host. Then, I too find the topics explored here less a means of releasing or exercising, but as an exercise in transformation and rehabilitative capabilities in producing hope, that writing traumas that are not inherently damning becomes a form of reparative writing, repatriative writing, so as to make space for one to live wholly in a body whose zipper is missing teeth. And lastly, three, with the help of professional services such as therapy, I find myself ready and prepared to narrate these traumas into oration as a form of gift giving, where it may sound like I am attempting to write in a paranoid vein to match and meet the expectation of this larger project we call Can Lit. It is more so a form of accountable storytelling to and for communities who are impacted and embroiled within the entanglements of mental health under the weight of cultural and actual genocide within the nation states of Turtle Island. Just going to take a quick sip here. I would call much of queer and or BIPOC writing biotextual, in such a way, as I noted above, that the body of text is wholly intertwined with our physical bodies. I might even go so far as to call my philosophy of writing method acting. This is not something I've ever learned in creative writing classes. Instead, I was taught not to invest too much of myself into the stories I crafted, to remain partial, even though we teach under the premises of show, don't tell, and write what you know. What this tells me is that my histories, my body, my areas of expertise are cumbersome, that my body wouldn't fit within the tightening garter of Can Lit, that the bio stories I wanted to tell challenged and made anxious those who saw themselves, consciously or not, complicit within the series of violence I so easily orated. A biotextual protagonist, Jonny, from my novel Jonny Appleseed, is a character very much embroiled with my own histories and experiences, to the point that I am often mistaken as Jonny himself. In fact, many people, while asking me questions, have interpolated me as Jonny instead of Joshua, and I have encountered this in weirdly briefly explored romantic encounters as well. But I'll leave that as an aside. The consumption of BIPOC and queer writing interests me in this perplexity, in that a text that is so clearly denoted as a novel, which is the subtitle to Jonny, is too readily misread as memoir or boudoir. I'm teaching myself that I need to be a person first and a writer second. Have you ever felt like one of the lopsided gifts of being a storyteller, an academic, a writer in any sense, is that you can craft narrative so well you can convince yourself of its unwavering validity? Another lesson not taught in creative writing classes is that the economics of trading one's mental health in for a slice of readership is damning. These days, I find myself racked with anxiety. One, because I feel I have traded in so much of my personal life and relations in order to find myself in the particular position I am in within the field of CanLit and the institution of academia. It costs a great deal to be so readily available and away in order to garner success under a capitalistic and colonialist system. What I have learned in the act of retrospection here in the stasis of COVID-19 is that there is a way in which my mental health can and has been abated, or at least temporarily held, in the state of being busy. And by being busy, I really mean overworked, hustling, barely holding on to the ledge of the world in which each interview, op-ed, guest lecture, workshop wrenches from deep within my biceps the anabolic acid needed to garner the strength to lift myself back onto that already crumbling horizon. Then, when I stand into a fractured state of being, precarity and loneliness now being such an address, I have to ask, is this what selfhood ought to feel like? Why do I only feel the trace of wholeness when I'm thrust into the busyness of such business? I'd like a deeper sense of selfhood that isn't so entombed in the purpose of servitude. Perhaps I think of Full Metal Indigi-queer, the book of poetry, as something akin to the work of what Eve Sedgwick calls paranoid reading, which is to name a type of paranoia that I believe many disempowered folks, such as BIPOC, queer, disabled, trans, etc., encounter when reading books written about their lives from a vantage point of one who has never been embroiled or experienced such livelihoods. Then I feel apt to name the stylizations of Full Metal's tone a type of paranoid writing instead of reading, inasmuch that I was writing against the canon, against literary productions that often co-opted, appropriated, and or depicted Indigenous, and more importantly, two-spirited lives as fungible, as disposable, and as wholly vanishing. In such a vein of thought, I would then call the tone of my novel Jonny Appleseed a type of reparative writing, again to borrow from Sedgwick's reparative reading, as a modality for writing ethically, respectfully, and medicinally outside of, and sometimes beyond, the reach and the scope of non-Indigenous purviews. In this light, both books talk to one another. They cross over, almost as if they were in the same literary universe. I have let my stories lead me to where they need to go. I think that's my role as an otachimu, a storyteller, in which I also enfold being an academic into, that I listen fiercely to character and simply animate them as they wish to be. This is what led me to this current project from which I'm sharing, that Jonny, my narrator, taught me a valuable lesson through their storyhood, and I quote, "A humility is just a humiliation you loved so much it transformed." I have used this as a guiding principle in my life in thinking about how I relate to my mental well-being and began asking myself, how can I/we be accountable to that which we consider damning? Or how can I be in a healthy and reciprocal relationship with that which we stigmatize? If we animate our pains as people wounded beyond belief and think of them as kin rather than parasitic, can we make love to them? Can we transform them? The multiplicity of bodies you house is a necessary worlding indeed. In conclusion, if I were to teach you anything about writing as an academic, as a novelist, as a poet, or just as a storyteller, I would first and foremost say, forget what you were taught about the greats, the masters, the canons. Never write to whiten yourself. Edge your story so as to maintain the fluidity of your queerness. Cough up a lung of glitter and maintain that femme glimmering. Your story is valuable and valued. Conceptualize your elders as theorists, community as canonic, your stories as sorely needed, because they are. Nourish your body so as to enrich the body that is textual, and never sell or give it away freely for the idiom of success. Having said that, never consume wholly and freely. Be strategic and selective in what you choose to record and narrate. Be weary not to become the consuming voyeur yourself in any type of relations you may be in. Stories are animate kin, those we write and those we are gifted. Treat them as such. Storytell as if our lives depend on it, because they often do. Stories are survival mechanisms, and we know this in the eras we are living within. We need you with us, literally and literally, as to reshape the horizon of these nations' oral histories. As writers, as storytellers, as people within academia, we are never owned, we are owed. Always remember that. Thank you. Let me clear the throat and recenter this Zoom.
Yay! That was wonderful. Thank you, Josh. I haven't gotten any private questions, which I assume means that you guys want to speak your questions. So, who would like to start for us? Who out there in Zoom land?
And so I'll take a minute. Let's breathe.
Kai, did you want to unmute and speak for a minute?
Hi, Kai. Oh, I think you're muted, Kai.
Uh-oh. I'm muted. I'm sorry. I'm doing this on my phone, which is not typical. Thank you so much, Josh. This was a really amazing talk, and I feel like I have learned and like gotten a lot of great advice from it. I was wondering if you wanted to talk more about this idea that you mentioned of like our scars and our trauma as kin, because that was something that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't thought about. And just like if you have thoughts on how we can do that, how we can treat those parts of ourselves as kin in writing and elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a direct answer because I'm also trying to figure that out. But so a lot of my writing is body focused. And again, what I was trying to do in this, and I'm trying to think about, you know, the rising of these Indigenous voices, many of them queer, trans, non-binary, Indigenous women, is like to think about the multiplicity of the noun body. So when we say body, we could be referencing our bodies. We could be referencing bodies of water, bodies of land, bodies of text. They all kind of mingle together, right? All of these different permutations of body are interconnected and in relation. At least that's how I think of them, from a kind of a Cree perspective. But when I was thinking about writing, and I remember when I was taking creative writing classes, and I was basically being taught, like force-fed, everyone from like Dickens to Shakespeare through to the beatniks, through to all these white writers, basically, most of them men. So that when I tried to write, I was unable to produce these kind of aesthetic texts for the sake of them being pretty, or like I've never been to Paris. I can't be writing about the Parisian cafes that the Lost Gen did, etc. The only thing that I could write was from the body and with the body. And I just remember, like, I really like to kind of think when you're writing as like you're like a director. So you kind of have, you know, these large landscape shots, but that's gorgeous, I guess, for exposition. But what's really the story is like focusing in on the minute. And I would do this with partners or with myself, is to like survey the body, and just like how that surveying of body, the appreciation of bodies in whatever form that body may be in, opened up these like beautiful series of storytelling. It's almost like a photo album. I would kind of consider the body, and again, bodies in multiplicity. That, like, you know, I would just be like surveying my own body or bodies of others and be like, what's this scar from? And then there's like whole stories just within that tiniest little scar, or a chickenpox scar, or any type of like modification to the body. And I thought that was so beautiful in my own relations within the world. I was like, how can I bring that into the relations of the body of text that I was trying to produce? And so I really wanted to hone in on how bodies are really kind of shaped by the ways in which they've been changed or altered or hurt, or also brilliantly loved in the world, right? And the bodies themselves become like libraries in that sense. So I really wanted to kind of bring that to the forefront in what I was writing. And I think Jonny Appleseed was very much that, my novel. And then I came to this new book that I'm writing, which was like last year. My previous partner who I already in this, I broke up after 4 years. So I was in this very much kind of space of like depression and anxiety. I survived a sexual assault after that. And then, yeah, I just started to produce things like panic attacks, anxiety disorder that I was basically I live with now. That I was like, okay, I'm in this very different state of being. And then that was all exacerbated with COVID-19 and Trudeau and Trump's proposed pipelines and all this targeted killing of Black and Indigenous folks and other BIPOC queer folks. And I was just like, the world's so fucked up. Excuse my language, but it's on fire. And I was like, this COVID-19 is not the first apocalypse. Indigenous, Black folks, people of color have survived. It's only apocalyptic because it's beginning to affect whiteness, really. So yeah, I was like, how can I appropriately and ethically house, but also live with, and then also like think of or attune my ear to mental health. And the way that I was able to do that was, again, to think, to put it, like to translate all of that into Nêhiyaw, or the Cree language again, in which it's always asking me, it's like I have to animate it because it's not an inanimate thing. And in that animation, I was like, okay, well then I'm accountable to it just as much as I would animate, the body of the Bow River just outside my house, which I'm also accountable to. So I was beginning to think, like, if it's an animate being, really, it becomes, like, it doesn't obviously become material, but it becomes real in a sense that it becomes tangible, I guess. And I was like, well, what does something like, anxiety is giving us, like, clues to be leaving spaces, right? Or ideas about unsafeness. And so I'm like, there also is, for me, I was like trying to think about mental health as both animate and then also as ancestral, I guess. Not to say that I'm like Indigenous peoples are like wholly born with mental health, but we are impacted intergenerationally. So it would make sense that there would be like whispers in the codex that sometimes might emerge into something we might call as an anxiety attack, right? So I'm just trying to conceptualize it in that sense, I suppose. I hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. That was great.
It's nice to see you, Kai.
Okay. I have a question in the chat. You spoke to it just a tiny bit at the end of this last answer that you gave, but
Sure.
a viewer is wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the ways that you view trauma and mental health as ancestral knowledge. I think that sort of just picks up where you left off in the last question.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah, like, I don't know, like in the beginning of this kind of my travail into mental health, I kept thinking, I was like, oh, like, why is this happening to me? So I very much have really bad insomnia. I have really strong bouts at times with anxiety and panic attacks, which has been heightening, but being leveled out in the current era and predicaments that we are in. And then I also live with I've had for like the last, I'm 31 now, so it's like the last 12 years, also lived with eating disorders. So I'm both anorexic and bulimic. And I've worked with those and they're mitigated. But I just remember, like, when this was all culminating, I was like, why is this happening to me? Like, I've never had many of these things, such as insomnia before. Like, this is such a curse. And I was, like, such things as antidepressants just weren't working for me. And I think it was because I was thinking about it as something, maybe I would say I was thinking about it from a Western perspective and an individualistic perspective, that when I went to such things as therapy or counseling, you would do these like little questionnaires at the beginning of each one. And it would be like on a scale of 1 to 5, and it's like these same questions every week, so that you get this rating system. And then it was like, it's color coded, so you want to be in this like green, that's when you're like okay and good, and then it goes yellow, red, and like that's you're in like a bad range, I guess, whatever that means. But I remember having the conversation, and this was maybe like the beginning of COVID, when we were just in lockdown here, And I was isolated by myself, and I was doing the same routines day in, day out. And then night times would just become nightmarish to me because I was like, I won't be able to fall asleep, etc. And that just repeated and repeated. Then when I was in the sessions, and they were like, oh, your scores are like obviously skyrocketing upwards into this red zone. I was like, well, why am I being like this test that you give me? Who often do you see, and who has helped you to make this test? My therapist is a South Asian therapist. I really wanted to have at least a racialized person in my life in that kind of therapeutic sense. And she was like, well, yeah. She's like, no one really ever asked me that question, that we are like rating ourselves on a universal that is most likely produced by probably like white het cis men who have access to mental health services. It's very expensive. And again, these questions like, why am I rating what had happened to me and my intergenerational trauma as like the son of a residential school survivor, a 60 scoop survivor, having missing and murdered Indigenous women in my life, having murdered family and friends as well. Why am I rating my traumas onto the same register as, say, John Doe, who's like living in suburbia with a white picket fence and like has a mild case of depression? Like that's like, they don't compare. So then I had to kind of reconceptualize, and again, it was like I was speaking to in the last answer, it was like really trying to indigenize my relationship to something we might call mental health, right? And I had to do so in order for me to kind of ethically entertain and attribute myself to that, because I felt the call that I had to write about this, because we have like unprecedented youth suicides across Turtle Island, many of them because lack of access to mental health care, to historical traumas that bring about things such as transphobia and homophobia and femphobia. It becomes super hyper masculine, so it's quite violent to be in these spaces as queer, two-spirit Indigenous peoples, or just as Indigenous youth in general, because you don't have access to these things, right? Like mental health is stigmatized and demonized and masculinized, that for one to announce that they may be suffering from something like anxiety or depression or have suicidal inclinations as an Indigenous youth is often just kind of basically shoved to the side, right? It's like we've survived bigger things, which we have, but that it doesn't erase it from the very codex of our beings. So I suppose, yeah, like for example, with insomnia, I was like, okay, obviously insomnia sucks, like, but it's also a gifting indeed too, because I'm like thinking about, in some of the times in my writing workshops, I'll say, people were like, well, how did you like conceptualize a character like Johnny? Who seems so like real. And I was like, Johnny has been a character that's lived with me for a long time. But the advice I gave was like, sleep with your characters. And people think that's hilarious. But I was like, what I mean is like, when I'm having these insomniac bouts, I could sit there and think anxiously about everything. But what has been productive creatively for me is to think how insomnia might be gifting me. So what I do in these moments is like really kind of, as I said in my talk, like method act, like get into the headspace of these characters and ask like, what do they smell like? What are their aspirations? Like what harms them? Do they have allergies? Are they lactose intolerant like most Indigenous people? Like just minute things like that. And then I often found myself like dreaming with them or as them or of them. And I was like, well, this is a beautiful gifting that insomnia is also giving me. And then also things like anxiety and panic attacks. I was like, yeah, it's not good. It's not fun. I don't say I enjoy having these things, but I can also conceptualize them as like, as I was saying to Kai right now, is like, they're almost like secret messages or whispers hidden into the very vertebrae of our being as survivors of genocides. That's many times when I've had anxiety attacks, it was because I was in specific situations or spaces which I maybe wasn't consciously aware of, that were like unsafe, physically or mentally or emotionally or verbally. And I was like, oh, these are like cues to leave, right? Like to trust your gut, which is like two types of brains going at the same time, like that popular idiom, trust your gut. I was like, oh, like for me, this is, I guess what I would say, ancestral knowledge just coming in the shape and form and whisperings of something like an anxiety attack. something like a panic attack, that these are signs and systems of awareness, and perhaps flight too from situations which may seek to harm or damn us.
Great. Sorry, I don't mean to say great after you're like pouring your heart out to us.
No, no worries.
Fail on my part. Sorry.
All adjectives work.
I have a question Sarah Goodman would like to ask. Would you like to unmute yourself, Sarah?
Yes, hi. First of all, this is, a wonderful talk. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I was interested in what you call literary voyeurism in paranoid writing, but especially in relation to the indigi-queer identity. As you know, the indigi-queer identity, by virtue of not being straight and white, does not benefit from white privilege or straight privilege and is thus under more scrutiny. Could you expound upon literary voyeurism in relation to indigi-queerness specifically?
Yeah. So like, I think, well, I guess I would say all reading and writing and sharing of story is a little bit voyeuristic. Again, if we're thinking about bodies and bodies of text and bodies together, right? But I think there's a different ethic when you are sharing personally or privately with a group of friends or like partners, or yeah, I guess I would say even the institution of academia is very voyeuristic. Never mind, I won't say that. But what I'm doing is, so basically like the beginning of the keynote, I was trying to say like there's a rise of Indigenous voices, many of whom are Indigenous and queer or two-spirit or Indigenous women, that there's almost like we have to I have to conceptualize the kind of institutions of Canadian literature and American literature as, I guess, consuming machinations. And I might even go so far as like call them like Wendigo or like cannibalistic eaters for the sake of just consuming. And because it's capitalistic, because it's colonialist, like there may be this need to push that we need more Black writers, we need more Indigenous writers, we need more Asian writers and queer writers and trans writers. But I'm also not I'm not unattuned to the fact that this call for these writers, because they're like maybe becoming popularized now and are stories that folks want, is because there's a hunger for whiteness for those stories. Well, not just whiteness, but primarily whiteness, because it runs those institutions, right? So I guess in this type of like perhaps the diversifying of those who we publish, how we publish them, when it's done through the major publication systems such as Penguin, Random House, or the big six, it's done so primarily from white minds, white thinking, white hands. But those hands are like that whiteness is so embroiled within capitalism that it immediately becomes for me a type of kind of constraint, and I might even say a type of kind of literary colonialism too, because they're not fully produced on the same par. Say if I wanted to publish with an Indigenous press that had Indigenous funding, that wasn't actively engaged in pipelines and divestment, and was Indigenous edited, like that's like the utopic dream for me, I guess I would say. That's the type of future I hope to see, but it's not, right? So, what I was trying to get at is like when we publish these texts and we publish them through these colonialists, capitalist machinations, we're doing so with the expectation for me to sell myself, my stories, my bodies, text and mine, in order to kind of receive publicity or to receive accolades or award nominations, right? And also to sell. So I would guess it's a type of voyeurism for me, because when folks read these texts, they immediately think, again, like my novel or my poetry, my nonfiction, we'll see what happens with that because it is nonfiction, but these two fictional elements are immediately read as a confession from me. And primarily for like non-BIPOC readers, in that they're like, oh, we're gaining purview into an Indigenous life, into a queer life, into an impoverished life, into a sex worker's life, which Johnny's about, and thereby like that Joshua and Johnny must be simultaneously the same, or Joshua and Zoa, like the character from Full Metal, must be simultaneously the same. That because they're produced from these consuming publishing houses, the readers too, I think, take on the mindset of consuming. And in one of the questions I pose is like, is can a story be eaten like a body? It's because I think, yeah, like for me, the purchasing of BIPOC and or queer text right now is a type of expectation for either alleviation or also for kind of insight and entrance into that person's livelihood, that person's way of being, that person's communities. And I think I see that specifically right here in Canada with Indigenous writing and, you know, all of the kind of anti-colonial or decolonial work that we are trying to do here, like with Sowetan in the West Coast. And I think in the US, it's also very much happening with Black writers at the same time, is like this kind of the surge and rise of anti-Black texts, sometimes many of them written by non-Black writers, as this mode of alleviation, right? And it's also this type of voyeurism. So like there's always, what I'm trying to get at was like literary voyeurism, how I might characterize it, is the purchasing of a text by a BIPOC writer is by a non-BIPOC reader is always going to maybe, not always, but often make this kind of allowance for alleviation and entrance, I guess. In, again, thinking the larger question of like the body of text is the body, those go hand in hand, right? So it's just like some large kind of, I would say, institutional notices that I've been trying to be like more attuned to in how I'm perceived as a person and as a producer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your answer.
Oh, thanks for asking it. That's a great question.
Yes, thank you. Last call for questions. I don't have any more queued up, but if you'd like to unmute yourself for a minute.
I have a question. Hi, everybody. My name's Dominique, pronoun she, her. I'm like in a onesie right now. That's why I don't have my camera on, but I'm glad to be here with all of you. It's a Grinch onesie. And so my question more so has to do with what you said about this kind of sense of entitlement to your trauma that the reporter had. And I'm just kind of wondering how you navigate that as a public figure. And I guess if there's that piece, then kind of wondering how you navigate that, but then also, is that process healing for you at all, or is it more re-traumatizing? And I wanted you to kind of speak to that, and also, you know, talk a bit about if you've ever set boundaries, or if you feel like it is important to set boundaries as a public figure of like how much of your life is consumable, if that makes sense. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Oh, thanks, Dominique. I would probably personally be in one of my hoodies right now, which is a German Shepherd hoodie. If I wasn't on camera, I'm literally wearing like Adidas tiny little shorts under this. So I'm happy about Zoom. I only have to dress the top half. Yeah, and that story specifically, I guess, like again, I was very much a new writer, and I think creative writing classes and creative writing in general, in Canada at least, had trained me to be like, any kind of bone that's thrown your way, go fetch it and bring it back, because you need to like make that pile of bones to like get into the next level of success, right? And what I learned now is, as a writer or as an academic or even just as a person in the world, is to like set boundaries and know or think about the ethics of why someone's asking me that question. Like, what are they trying to extract from me in order, what are they getting from it, right? Here, this reporter just wanted basically clickbait. It's like Joshua Whitehead wrote about his dead aunt. So setting boundaries around the power of no too, which I think a lot of BIPOC folks, queer folks, women would, or any intersection of those would say, like, we're like trained to never say no. That we need to continually say yes, because in institutions of power, like, we're gonna have to work 2 or 3 times as hard, which we do, right? We do have to work 3 times as hard in order to be in that kind of same space. But I've also just been thinking about the power of like rejection. And I think I learned this. So with my first book, Full Metal Indigi-queer, as Kaylee noted, like it was nominated for these two awards. It was also nominated for a Lambda Literary Award, but it was nominated for a Lambda Literary Award for trans poetry. And I was like, there's no trans characters in this. I don't identify as trans. I've never had been in a space where I would know any semblance of the experience of transness. So I withdrew it from the Lambda, much to their dislike. And everyone was like, take the accolade, like even if you don't win or whatever, like you don't have to be trans to win the trans poetry category, which I was like, this is some messed up politics. Considering that the trans poetry category had only been introduced to the Lambdas. You know, folks don't know what the Lambdas are. The Lambdas are like the kind of one of the biggest kind of LGBTQ award systems that we have. So it's a high honor to be published or to be recognized by them, let alone or even to win. So I'm nominated for this trans poetry award. Everyone, including publishers and whatnot, were like, you need to like take this accolade. And that category had only been introduced maybe like 6-7 years ago by the activist work of trans women of color primarily. That I was like, that was not my experience. Like I'm not going to take from trans folks, because this taking is a story I know all too well. So I withdrew. I said no, I rejected. And I think that was an important lesson for me, is that we don't need to be so individualistic and take and consume. In that not taking, I was able to draft this open letter and call, like there should be categorizations for queer indigeneity or two-spirit literature. And it kind of opened up this beautiful conversation that I think brought this discussion to the forefront, of like people in that Lambda categorization, but then also people saying, you know, maybe I don't need to take everything that's given to me. So like for me, I really learned like the power of rejection, or the power of no, opens up when you like hit that dead end, or you make that dead end yourself. It opens up all these other beautiful kind of cascading pathways, which allow other entrances for community building and making. So I've really tried to like bring that into how I just be in the world as a person, or as an academic, or as a writer, in that sometimes saying no primarily to systems of whiteness, or systems of heteropatriarchy, or systems of cisness, I don't need to take every space that's offered me. And when I say no to those, I open up opportunities for blossoming for other BIPOC queer writers at the same time. So like that's a modality that I really try to kind of bring to the forefront. And now, like I ask, like, why are you asking me this question? I'm allowed to say no. And sometimes saying no is a political radical act itself, because you shut down systems of power that think they can continually and freely take from BIPOC people, queer folks, women writers, etc. And it's also shown me that it's a beautiful allowance for, I guess what I would say, instead of vertical, lateral growth, for the communities that we're trying to build, for this hopeful Indigenous voice rising future, Black Indigenous voice, right? Like this BIPOC future where we need to build for each other, right?
That was really great, Josh. Just in the interest of time, you know, Zoom fatigue, we're going to be done with questions, but I did want to announce that I have selected the raffle winners. So if I call your name and you're still on the call, if you could put your email address in the chat, and then I can like get your info for you. So the winner of Full Metal Indigi-queer, which I don't have my copy with me. I'm sorry. It's locked in my office back on campus. Is James Cocorinos. If you're here, James, yay. The winner of Jonny Appleseed, which I have here, beautiful one, is Donna McNeil. Donna, if you're here, if you could put your email in the chat, yay. And then winner of Love After the End, which is the newest one, is Dana Chamberlain, if you're still here. So I would love to get your email addresses. If it turns out that they're not here with us, I will call the raffles and I'll email you through other means. So thank you, Josh, so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us. This was really lovely, really smart questions, really wonderful to hear from you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for coming.